Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe. Live from CGTN in London, I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China stocks see the worst slump on Wall Street since the global financial crisis. We're live in New York.
Our other headlines, the outlook for the global economy. The IMF publishes its forecast for the world's finances. We look at the winners and the losers.
After a terrible start, the EU says 70% of adults have now received at least one vaccine dose.
And another dramatic day at the Olympics as the US loses star Simone Biles and has to settle for silver in the women's gymnastics final. Chinese stocks listed in the United States have seen their biggest sell-off since the global financial crisis in 2008.
A clampdown on Chinese companies ranging from education firms to the technology sector is fueling the sell-off. Let's talk now to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. Hello to you, John. So what's the picture looking like now?
Hey, Robin. Hey, Robin. Hey, Jamie. Well, this is such a nuanced story, I think, particularly for us here on CGTN, as we strive to tell the world what is really going on from both capitals, Beijing, of course, and also Washington, D.C. / New York, where I am at the moment. So it is very nuanced, and I'll attempt to explain the nuances in just a second. But it's also fair to say that we have a regulatory rout going on among the ADRs, which are the American Depository Receipts, which is the way these Chinese companies trade here in North America. Now, I think the first thing to say is that China does not think that it's on the wrong side of history here, and it's showing no signs of backing down in these crackdowns that we've been reporting for the last couple of weeks. I think Beijing thinks that it is targeting appropriately and fining appropriately and looking into situations that it's concerned about, all completely appropriately. So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. And of course, it began in April of this year, as far as I remember, if my memory serves me correctly, with a fine for Alibaba over antitrust issues, and that was $2.8 billion back then. Then the whole issue of targeting various Chinese companies moved on to the techs, most supremely, of course, Didi, which I don't know whether you think of Didi like this, but I think of them as a car ride-hailing company, when really they are a global technological behemoth. And the people behind Didi have said, look, you know, we are Chinese, but we want to rule the world, basically. We want to be a global company. And indeed, they do operate in many countries, as you know, around the world. Well, the tech crackdown on Didi from the Chinese internet authorities looking into cybersecurity issues came just 2 days after the IPO of Didi here in New York, and that stock is now down by a full 50%, more than a half now, in the few weeks that it's been trading here. Then it moved on yesterday and this week to the education companies. We first got wind of that, I think, last Friday. Tal Ed and New Oriental, and also Tencent. And I didn't realize when I was talking to you yesterday that Tencent has actually been a target of this too. Chinese government saying no more global music deals for you over at Tencent. So their share price has been tumbling. And indeed, the ADRs generally have been tumbling here this morning. And you're right to say this is the worst rout for them since 2008. Now, what about the American side? Well, here in New York, they can't understand why there is a battle going on between government authority and power and economic authority and power, because here at the stock exchange, these things are seen as entirely suitable for both entities, you know, the government and for the companies, Chinese companies, to go out there and be big and dominate the world and do very well. So they can't understand why Beijing is doing what it's doing at the moment. That's here. Now, Alibaba, Pinduoduo, JD, NetEase and Baidu have all lost about $184 billion, or at least they have declined in their value by $184 billion in the last month because of what is going on. Here at the stock exchange, there are now calls for the SEC, the leading regulator, to come out and make it very clear to American investors about the dangers, as it would be seen from this point of view, of investing in these Chinese companies. We know that some Chinese IPOs that were talked about and were planned for later in the year have been postponed or cancelled. But the final thing I think I should say is you have to remember that we are dealing with adults here at the end of the day. You know, I mean, people in New York, they know the risks about investing in these overseas companies. And I will tell you this, the message from here right now is don't panic. Not yet. Don't panic just yet, because I think they think this is all going to come right in the end, that the Beijing government will have its say, and do what it wants to do. And I don't think people here think that the companies are going to go away completely. And that's all I can tell you at the moment. That's where we are today. Tomorrow, maybe a different story, but that's where we are right now.
So, John, tell us some more, if you will, about the actual firms that are being impacted.
Yeah, well, let's begin with the education ones, shall we, first of all, because that's the newest. Now, TAL Education and New Oriental were down sharply yesterday, and they were down sharply on Friday. So today, because we're talking about this now, they're now up. Of course they are. So their TAL Education is up 5%, and New Oriental is ahead by almost 1%. So I think that speaks to what I was just saying, about realizing that these companies are probably here to stay. Didi, on the other hand, really has been hard hit. I just told you it was down 50% in a month, and it's now down a further 6% today. And then the others, Alibaba is down 5% now, Pinduoduo is down 10%, JD is down 6%, Baidu 4%, and NetEase down 4% as well. But overall, here at the stock exchange in New York, I'm afraid it's earnings which are overcoming any worries about the ADRs or any concerns about COVID. And by the way, we're going to have a big announcement in about 3 hours' time here in which the CDC is going to recommend Americans, even if you've been vaccinated, put the masks back on in certain situations. So that's for another day. And the reason that the earnings are overshadowing everything is that they're coming in really hot. Tesla last night, for the first time, was a $1 billion company in terms of net income. Now, net income is all the money that you bring in. Once you've paid off all your costs, you've got your net income, and it was $1 billion for the first time. 90% of the S&P 500 have reported sales hikes among those companies that are reported so far. There's talk of an infrastructure bill now at last, agreement between Republicans and the Democrats. That will help jobs and wages and also inflation, but let's put that to one side for now. The markets, I think, here now are looking for a jobs recovery for the autumn. And so, at this very moment, coming off the back of record highs on Friday and yesterday, we do have the markets down. The Dow is down 0.4%, the Nasdaq's down 1.7%, S&P 500 down by 0.8%. And just speaking to the ADRs again, the Hang Seng was down 4.2% today because many of them trade in Hong Kong as well. So that's kind of where we are. And of course, just to finish off, actually, we have some huge earnings after the bell tonight. So at about 9 o'clock in the evening, 10 o'clock in the evening UK time, we're going to hear from Apple and Alphabet and Microsoft and Starbucks. Guys?
John, thanks very much for updating us. John Terrett there in New York.
Well, let's look at the wider global economy. The International Monetary Fund has announced it will keep its global growth forecast at 6% for this year. But it warns there is increasingly uneven global recovery as the gap between rich and poor countries widens in this pandemic.
We are upgrading growth for advanced economies, and that's almost entirely offset by a downgrade for emerging markets and developing economies. Next year, we have upgraded growth to 4.9%, and that's mainly driven by anticipated further fiscal support in the U.S. One of the major fault lines remains the pandemic. If we see newer virus variants, which are far more transmissible, like the Delta variant that we're seeing right now, in a world where vaccine access remains highly inequitous, that will have a big hit to the economic recovery.
Well, let's talk to Lorenzo Codogno now, visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Professor, welcome back. Good to have your company. What do you think is the key message from this IMF report?
Clearly, the IMF is pointing its finger on the widening of global fault lines. And that means between countries, among countries, but also within countries. In other words, inequalities within countries as a result of the pandemic shock. And the factors are basically two. One is access to vaccine, and the second one is access to financing, because some countries are constrained in what they can do in terms of policy space, because clearly they cannot have access to proper financing for their fiscal policy. And so that's really the dividing lines between the advanced world at this stage and the developing and low-income countries. And that is the big problem for the economy, global economy, and the big issue that the IMF is trying to raise here.
And vaccine access for the IMF is obviously a significant factor in global economic recovery. Until everyone has access to vaccines, then no one is out of this pandemic.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely, because I think there are two risks here. One is that, only the advanced countries get proper vaccination for the whole population or most of it. And with the risk that you might have contagion in the future because clearly people are moving around. And so that's one first issue. The second issue is that you might actually, by allowing the virus to spread with different variants, you might end up at some point with a variant that might actually challenge the coverage of the current vaccination. So I think that's the two risks that we are facing here. And clearly, this is not just a problem for human lives, but it's also a problem for the economy.
Lots of concerns about inflation for understandable reasons at the moment. How do you think the IMF views that?
Well, they choose to go for a sort of balancing act because they take the mainstream view that the current surge in inflation is temporary due to transitory factors such as the mismatch between demand and supply. Supply is not able to catch up with the growth in demand for now in many sectors, transportation, but also production and so forth. And then there are some base effects and some other temporary effects. Of course, the IMF thinks that this is all transitory, so it shouldn't be really considered too much, and the central bank should not respond to that. At the same time, the IMF also highlights that the behavior of expectations is absolutely crucial. I would add myself also the behavior of underlying inflation in terms also of wages. And I'm thinking about the US because the US is probably the only country where the risks are non-negligible at this stage. So I think it's a balancing act. At some point, you have to monitor the situation, but also at some point you have to decide to better understand whether this is really temporary, as most people believe right now, or there are more fundamental reasons to believe that inflation is here to stay for a while.
You've identified the concerns. So what action is the IMF calling for from governments around the world?
Well, the IMF is an international organization. They deal with countries, so it's no wonder that one issue that they want to be addressed is some kind of debt cancellation, if you wish, at the global level, and some financial support for countries that are in difficulties. I think this is absolutely essential to reestablish some kind of sustainability for the countries that have been most affected. But we shouldn't forget that whenever you have debt forgiveness, you have someone else that is facing a loss. So I think you have to balance these two aspects and find out a solution that maintains financial stability for the world.
Professor Lorenzo Codogno at the London School of Economics, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
London's FTSE 100 has fallen as shares in household products group Reckitt Benckiser dropped 9%. The company says demand for cleaning products, such as disinfectants, which surged during the pandemic, has started to slow. Operating profit margins declined, which Reckitt says was down to higher costs of plastic and other commodities.
The world's biggest luxury goods group, LVMH, has reported strong earnings in the second quarter, with revenue 14% higher than pre-pandemic levels. Most of the growth has been powered by its fashion lines like Dior and Louis Vuitton, along with an increase in champagne sales, with much of the demand coming from China and the United States.
Billionaire businessman Jeff Bezos is offering to cover $2 billion in NASA costs in exchange for his company, Blue Origin, being reconsidered for a contract to build a moon landing system. NASA awarded Elon Musk's SpaceX the original contract in April, rejecting Bezos's bid, saying it could only afford one contractor. The planned spacecraft aims to fly astronauts to the moon as early as 2024.
The tech company Intel says it'll start manufacturing chips for Qualcomm, the company which powers most major Android phones. Intel says it's expanding its new foundry business, aiming to catch up with rivals Samsung and Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing by 2025.
Electric car maker Tesla has recorded profits of more than $1 billion in the 3 months to the end of June. The company, founded by billionaire entrepreneur Elon Musk, says it delivered a record 200,000 electric vehicles over that period. Ferdinand Dudenhofer is director of Centre Automotive Research, a non-profit organisation providing research for the industry.
If you look at the Q2 results of Tesla, we see that they very strongly increased its sales. However, they reduced its costs, and that is a mistake to become profitable. And part of that profitability is, of course, due to China and to a new sort, a new type of battery, the iron phosphate battery, which are in China very popular, for example, with BYD and other car makers. And Tesla did that battery cells used for the Model 3 standard version, and that reduced dramatically costs.
And Tesla says that public support for greener cars is greater than ever. Do you think they are now ready to go mainstream?
Yes, green cars are the mainstream and will the mainstream tomorrow. On the one hand, the US, because Joe Biden is now president and Donald Trump no longer, and he wants to become CO2 neutral. The same applies to China. President Xi Jinping said in September last year that they want to have the peak of CO2 in 2030, and the same applies a few days ago from the EU Commission. So everybody wants to go in CO2 neutral cars and mobility, and the only way to do that is with electric-driven, battery electric-driven cars, and therefore we see a big push in the future in that segment.
There is a problem at the moment, though, isn't there? The global chip shortage. How bad is that for manufacturers?
The semiconductor crisis is very serious for the car industry. It started late 2020, and in our projections, it will last until 2023, early 2023, and we calculate that the total car industry will lose about 5.2 million sales during that time. So it's a very tough time for car makers, and we have to find new solutions for the future to make the supply chain for semiconductor more solid and more substantial.
And Tesla is trying to get around that by building a new gigafactory in Berlin, but that has also faced some setbacks, hasn't it?
So the Berlin factory of Tesla has some delays, possibly in the first months of 2022. In total, we see that Tesla has at the moment a lot of production capacities, on the one hand in Shanghai with about 450,000 cars, in the US with about 500,000 cars. The problem are not on the supply chain of producing cars, it's more or less having the customers for the cars, and on the other hand to be balanced the supply chain with the problems of the semiconductors.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. It had a slow start, but the EU says it's caught up on vaccination rollout and distribution. We look at what those targets mean now.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link. only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
After a slow start to procuring and distributing vaccines, the European Union says it has reached its summer vaccination target. That announcement was made by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Our target was to protect 70% of adults in the European Union with at least one dose of vaccination in July. Today we have achieved this target, and 57% of adults already have the full protection of double vaccination.
Well, despite initial supply problems, von der Leyen says the EU has now successfully caught up and is back among world leaders in the fight against COVID-19. But there's some scepticism in the medical community as to whether the targets mean anything. Let's talk to our correspondent Tony Waterman in Brussels. So, Tony, the Commission President sounding pretty triumphant there, but not everybody will be agreeing with her.
Yeah, absolutely not. There are some questions about whether or not the Commission or Brussels or Europe has actually even met this target. Of course, this is a milestone. It is a major turnaround from that blunderous start to the bloc's vaccine program. But many are saying that they did not exactly hit the mark. The Commission had repeatedly said that the goal was to vaccinate 70% of the adult population by the end of summer, and conveniently left off that very important detail that one dose would suffice to meet that target. But of course, we know that it is the second dose really that offers the maximum protection when it comes to the coronavirus, particularly the Delta variant. And of course, there are major discrepancies across the bloc when it comes to these vaccination rates. But that being said, the Commission has delivered enough doses to the member states to fully vaccinate 70% of the adult population. So it has, in a way, met that target. And certainly it's not going to be able to control what the member states do with those jabs once they have them in-house. But when compared to its peers, Europe is still lagging a bit behind when it comes to full vaccination. In the UK, it's just over 70%. In the United States, it's 60%. And when compared to China, it's actually right in line. According to Reuters COVID tracker, China has now fully vaccinated 56% of its population, which, of course, is 3 times the size of Europe's.
So, Tony, when do EU experts think that herd immunity can be reached?
Well, Robin, the interesting thing here is that herd immunity is actually a moving target. It is not a magical number, despite that 70% being dangled in front of us for so long. It is determined by a mathematical equation, which is dependent on the reproduction rate. And the Delta variant, which is now dominant, is highly infectious, so it has a very high reproduction rate, which means that many more people need to either be fully vaccinated or have recovered from the virus to reach herd immunity. And some experts are saying that it's 85% at this point. Some of them saying it could be as high as 98% of the entire population. And we know that in a lot of places, young children are still not eligible to be vaccinated. And there's a high rate of vaccine hesitancy among the population that is yet to receive a dose. So hitting this target of herd immunity is going to be very, very difficult, at least in the near term.
Tony Waterman in Brussels, many thanks.
Well, Spain's COVID immunisation programme has overtaken most other EU members, with more than half of its population now fully vaccinated. Our correspondent Rahul Pathak reports on the secret of their success.
Spain will have 3/4 of its adult population vaccinated by the end of the summer. The words of Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez back in November, before the start of his country's vaccination campaign. So the fact that Spain has now caught up with or overtaken both the UK and the United States in terms of share of population fully immunised means the country is likely to reach that target. Welcome news for Pedro Sánchez, something he was quick to acknowledge. In a tweet, the Prime Minister said, Spain has almost 55% of the population fully vaccinated. Our world in data returns to pick up the impressive rate of vaccination at which our country is progressing. Thanks to all the people who made this great success possible every day, we continue. And this is the statistic that the Prime Minister was so pleased about. As of the 24th of July, Spain had fully vaccinated 54.3% of its population. In Europe, that puts them above the UK, Germany, Italy and France. Now, one reason for the country's successful immunisation programme could be Spain's relatively high acceptance rates, with over 91% of people aged 40 or over opting to take the jab. And what makes the figures even more impressive is that between January and the end of April this year, Spain had fully vaccinated just 10% of its adult population.
The vaccination strategy used by Spain was to focus on full vaccinations to ensure we could deliver the second dose quickly, instead of trying to vaccinate everyone with the first dose. So just 21 days later, we administer the second jab to fully vaccinate those individuals.
We have to believe in the science and keep moving forward.
I think we trust in this for sure. You just have to look at the numbers of people already vaccinated. Back at the start, there was much more scepticism, and now it's a lot less. We can see it's working.
However, the vaccines have not been enough to stop the recent surge in coronavirus infections. The latest figures from Spain's health ministry showing the 14-day infection rate is now 700 per 100,000 people. That's amongst the highest in Europe, and that is a statistic that Spain's Prime Minister may be less eager to tweet about. Rahul Pathak, CGTN, Madrid.
Case numbers are also rising in Greece, but unlike Spain, vaccination rates are stagnating, with the country behind most other EU nations. That's led Athens to bring in some unusual incentives to persuade people to get vaccinated. Evangelos Sipsas reports.
If one takes a closer look, many people here at this vaccination center are young. The idea of getting vaccinated might not interest them, but when it comes with a €150 voucher and a freedom pass for traveling, attitudes can change. That is the latest initiative from the Greek government to encourage young people to get the vaccine, and some seem excited about it.
I think it's a good initiative, and I believe we're going in the right direction. We are all residents in this country, and we have to follow the measures of the government, since we all follow the Constitution.
This so-called Freedom Pass is designed to encourage the 18 to 25 age group to get vaccinated. Efforts have not stopped there, though. Patients unable to attend vaccination centers can now be inoculated against COVID-19 in their own home by any public or private sector doctor. But the third and most controversial measure is the mandatory vaccination for healthcare workers and other frontline staff, such as police and fire crews. This has led to a debate whether mandatory vaccination is even ethical, with some in the healthcare sector criticizing it.
The methods the government is using to get people vaccinated is hypocritical. Once more, they're trying to elevate responsibility and trying to hide their inaction when it comes to equipping the public health sector and enforcing mandatory checks.
As Greece falls behind most EU nations, with only about half of its population fully vaccinated, the government is using all resources it can to catch up, as health officials struggle to bring this pandemic under control. Evangelos Sipsas for CGTN, Athens, Greece.
The UK government's COVID app has advised hundreds of thousands of people to self-isolate. The so-called pingdemic has resulted in staffing problems and supply chain shortages. Now the government has come up with a solution: daily testing for workers in key sectors of the economy who will be exempt from quarantine. Nicole Johnston reports.
How do you keep businesses open when hundreds of thousands of people are being asked to self-isolate at home because of a potential exposure to coronavirus? Well, that's the dilemma facing the British government and businesses like supermarkets. But now the government has decided to expand its testing so that people can take a daily COVID test rather than having to sit at home isolating. It's going to open 1,200 testing sites for people working in 24 sectors, including not only supermarket workers, police and fire brigade staff, but also people working in communications, defence, border control and prisons. But for the rest, self-isolation is still the requirement.
I know that people have been frustrated about the pinging and the self-isolation. I totally understand that, particularly now as we're starting to see some better figures. But I think everybody understands that this is still a very dangerous disease. We do need to use the tools that we have. Self-isolation is the one that we've got. I urge people to do it.
Meanwhile, the epidemiologist who did the modelling which sent the UK into its first lockdown, Professor Neil Ferguson from Imperial College, says that the UK could be looking back on the pandemic by October. He says that the R rate, the reproduction rate, appears to be under 1, which means that the epidemic isn't growing. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says that the country is not out of the woods yet.
I've noticed that obviously that we're 6 days into some better figures, but it is very, very important that we don't allow ourselves to run away with premature conclusions about this. The step 4 of the opening up only took place a few days ago. People have got to remain very cautious, and that remains the approach of the government.
Rates of infection have been falling in the UK over the last week, but scientists say that it could be due to school holidays and warm weather. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
One person has died and 16 people have been injured after an explosion at an industrial park in Germany. Efforts are underway to find 4 people who are missing. Authorities have urged residents to stay indoors for fear of toxic gases. It's still not clear what caused the blast and subsequent fire.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, an unholy row, the scandal involving the Catholic Church, and a ruinous London property venture.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens.
4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change, We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas. Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no. We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. China stocks see the worst slump on Wall Street since the 2008 global financial crisis.
The IMF maintains its global growth outlook, but the picture is less rosy for some of the world's poorest countries.
And after a slow start, the EU says 70% of adults have now received at least one vaccine dose.
A Roman Catholic cardinal is on trial in the Vatican accused of misusing church funds in a ruinous London property deal. He's the most senior cleric to be tried for alleged financial crimes and is one of 10 people facing corruption charges in the landmark Vatican case. Our correspondent Naweed Jabarkal has been following proceedings. Naweed, just explain what the trial and these charges relate to.
Well, Jamie, the 73-year-old Cardinal Angelo Becciu is the most senior figure, as you say, in the Catholic Church to be tried for financial crimes. It's claimed that he spent almost $412 million to buy a property that's the church's money here in London's upmarket area of Chelsea. That's 60 Sloane Avenue, the building you can see behind me. A 2-year investigation at the Vatican alleged that he lost millions of dollars in that botched investment deal, which dates back to 2014. Now, throughout those years, the Cardinal was actually the head in charge of donations at the Holy See. He was removed from that position by Pope Francis last year after that investigation in September last year over the allegations, but he's always denied any wrongdoing. The charges he's facing, quite a lengthy charge sheet. They include embezzlement as well as fraud, abuse of office and channeling money to businesses run by his brothers in their native Sardinia, a small island off the coast of Italy. It's not just Cardinal Becciu on trial. 9 other people are also accused of financial crimes in this case, including a Swiss lawyer and 2 Italian investment brokers. All of them, like Cardinal Becciu, deny any wrongdoing.
Naweed, why is this case considered so significant for the Vatican and the Pope?
Yeah, it's something that Pope Francis has taken quite a personal interest in. It was his measures that really kick-started that investigation last year. The trial itself is going to take a long time. It's set to last for months, and the current hearings this week will be adjourned until October, according to Reuters. But if the defendants are found guilty, they could face jail terms, they could also face fines, or indeed both. And whatever the outcome is, as you say, this is a landmark case, mainly because any potential wrongdoing or allegations of wrongdoing by senior figures in the church can now be tried by ordinary judges and no longer tried by cardinals within the church itself. That's a really important change, and it's one that Pope Francis brought about. He changed that rule a few months ago in April, and really this is about trying to tackle allegations of corruption within the church, but also to try and make it more transparent for a global audience. Earlier this month, the city-state, in that regard, released some information about its assets, which show that it has more than 4,000 properties in Italy alone and another 1,120 across the rest of Europe. Jamie.
Luigi Barkle in London, thank you very much.
Tunisia's leading party is trying to ease the country's political crisis by calling for dialogue and urging supporters not to protest after accusing the president of launching a coup. Kais Saied sacked the Prime Minister and suspended Parliament. Now he's announced new COVID restrictions, including a curfew. Adnan Shawiashi reports.
The new restrictions come after clashes broke out on Monday in front of the Tunisian parliament where supporters of another party and others backing President Kais Saied gathered. These events follow Tunisian President Kais Saied's new presidential decree, under which he dismissed acting Interior Minister and Prime Minister Hisham Meshishi and National Defense Minister, as well as Civil Service Minister and Acting Justice Minister. The country's dismissed Prime Minister has agreed to hand over power to the new Premier, who will also be appointed by the President.
I'm speaking to you and to the Tunisian people. Everyone must stay calm. Do not respond to provocations and ignore all declarations and rumours spread by some individuals. I don't want a drop of blood to be shed. There's law, and law will be applied to everyone.
The Tunisian president accused several members of parliament as well as some business and political lobbies of misusing power to serve their own interests. The president's actions came after a day of protests against the government and the biggest party in parliament, the moderate Islamist Ennahda, following a spike in COVID-19 cases and growing anger over chronic political dysfunction and economic slump. The Tunisian public opinion remains divided. Many citizens have shown support for the presidential decrees, while other people have criticized Saied's recent moves.
Kais Saied should have made these decisions before. It's better late than never, though. The situation is chaotic because the former rulers failed after 10 years in power. We've been impoverished and starved, and our money is tight.
We are defending the legitimacy against a coup d'etat. Kais Saied's move is certainly a coup. Any wise person cannot accept it. We do not care about power, and we are not afraid of anyone.
The Tunisian General Labour Union hailed the social and popular protests held across the country. The UGTT urged the president to respect the constitution and ensure the continuity of the democratic process in Tunisia.
Prime Minister Hisham Meshishi has officially resigned and declared that he will hand over power to the next premier, who will be appointed by the head of state. President Kais Saied said he will respect the rights and freedoms and the deadlines for the formation of a new government in the next few days. Adnan Shawiashi, CGTN, Tunis.
A 24-year-old man has been convicted of inciting separatism and terrorism in Hong Kong in the first conviction under the region's national security law. The Hong Kong High Court found Tong Ying Kit guilty of driving his motorbike towards police officers, injuring 3 of them, while carrying a banner promoting the liberation of Hong Kong. He pleaded not guilty to the charges, and his lawyer argued it was impossible to prove the charges or that he committed the crime deliberately. He will be sentenced at a later date.
South Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea have restored a communication hotline in an effort to improve relations. The channel was cut off by Pyongyang a year ago following a failed summit. Both sides say the restoration of communications is the first step in rebuilding mutual trust.
US forces will formally end their combat mission in Iraq by the end of the year, but will still operate in an advisory role. The agreement was reached following a meeting between President Biden and Iraq's Prime Minister at the White House. There are currently 2,500 American troops in Iraq countering the remnants of the Islamic State group.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has held talks with his Mongolian counterpart. Both sides reached an agreement on deepening cooperation.
We greatly appreciate our cooperation on pandemic control. We decided to publish a joint declaration on enhancing cooperation to control the pandemic. We decided to build a public health community and emphasized that tracing the origin of the virus is a scientific task that should not be politicized. We call for global research on the origin of the virus.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, concern for US superstar gymnast Simone Biles as she withdraws from the team final, and a shock exit for one home favourite.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe.
The Tokyo Olympics has continued to provide more upsets on day 4, with the US missing out on gold in the women's team gymnastics final and having to settle for silver. That was the country's 25th medal.
The final was overshadowed by the withdrawal of star gymnast Simone Biles. We'll have more details on that for you shortly. Gymnasts from the Russian Olympic Committee won that event. China added 3 more golds, and Great Britain have now made their best ever start to the Games after winning 6 medals on day 4. There was also a shock exit in the women's singles tennis in Tokyo, as home favourite Naomi Osaka was beaten in straight sets in the 3rd round.
The current Australian and US Open champion was aiming to become the first ever Japanese player to win Olympic gold in tennis, but she lost out to the Czech Republic's Markéta Vondrasová. Osaka admitted the pressure of the occasion got to her. Meanwhile, Tokyo has reported its highest number of daily COVID cases since the start of the pandemic.
John Matthews is in the Japanese capital with more on that and the day's events at the Olympics.
Well, as of the end of Tuesday's competitions, the U.S. has taken the lead in overall medal count with 25. China is just behind with 21, but both with their 9 gold medals are just trailing Japan's 10 golds in the Olympic Games so far here in Tokyo. The Japanese team won that 10th gold at the end of the day as their softball team trounced the formerly undefeated U.S. softball side. But that wasn't the worst upset for Team USA. Simone Biles, all-around favorite gymnast from the U.S. team, pulled out of the gymnastics final just after a single vault. Her team is citing unspecified medical issues that the USA Gymnastics says she is being checked on a regular basis for medical clearance for any possible future events. Now, in her absence, the Russian Olympic team took the gold, with the U.S. taking silver. China took 3 golds today, 1 from the pool and 2 from shooting events. Now, broader in Tokyo, we've seen more than 2,800 new COVID cases reported on Tuesday, the highest so far since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, this number may be inflated somewhat because of the backload from the long weekend where tests could not be processed from some facilities. For example, we are still seeing a 15.7% positive rate of testing. That means that it's possible, since it's much higher than the 5% threshold indicating rapid spread, that caseloads may be ticking up much faster in the near future. Now, in response to a question as to whether or not this rising and record number of cases would affect the games. Yoshihide Suga, Prime Minister of Japan, said he has no plans, or that there are no plans to cancel the games or stop the games that are underway, saying that traffic has decreased in Tokyo, which contradicts some foot traffic survey data indicating that the hubs in Tokyo experienced higher traffic week on week during the long weekend. And with lots of travelers, we may be seeing many more cases rising here in Tokyo in the days ahead. John Matthews, CGTN, Tokyo.
Well, medals are not the only big prizes on offer at the Olympics. Away from the podium, there's the thriving world of memorabilia and pin collecting, which sees enthusiasts travel from around the world to meet up and trade Olympic pins.
With the Tokyo Games behind closed doors, the setup for traders is very different, of course, this year, but that hasn't hampered enthusiasm. CGTN's Francis Kuo met a collector in Washington.
At every Olympics, competition often takes center stage, but on the sidelines, always one standout event.
It's often called the other Olympic sport.
Here, athletes are absent and medals are MIA. The passion instead is on pins and trading them. James Kendall has been part of this Olympic tradition for 25 years, with the collection to prove it.
I've got over 5,000 Olympic pins.
Kendall is among thousands of avid Olympic pin traders worldwide. They anxiously await every game so they can trade in person through planned meetings and impromptu introductions. A tiny pin, often the seed for lasting friendships.
It's a way to engage people that you wouldn't normally talk to.
The variety of pins is mind-boggling. Host countries make their own, so do Olympic committees, corporate sponsors, and media outlets. The first pin in Olympics history was created before the 1896 Athens Games, made of cloth and featuring the Greek national emblem. But it was a much more recent games that got Kendall hooked.
1997, so it was after the big Atlanta Olympics.
Since then, he's accumulated an eclectic collection, many of them Olympic diving pins, inspired by his son, a competitive diver.
I've got diving pins going back to the 1870s.
The value of pins increases with their age, design, and rarity.
At the Salt Lake City Olympics, there was this green Jell-O pen. It was going for over $100.
The culture clearly has its quirks.
Some people just make it a goal to try to collect all 200 pins that the athletes are using for that year.
Kendall has been to 2 Olympics. Tokyo would have been his 3rd.
These are all the commercial pins.
He even bought a ton of Tokyo pins for trading. But pandemic restrictions now bar spectators from the games.
It was very disappointing. I had tickets for 5 different events in Tokyo. Not being able to go was just kind of heartbreaking.
So I thought I'd bring the pin experience to him.
I have a little bit of a surprise for you. Okay. I actually went to the London 2012 Olympics. Oh. You have 5,000 pins. I have like 12. I think you have this exact same one.
That's really neat.
For now, Kendall will be doing his pin trading online and at occasional trading conventions.
Let's say you lost this collection tomorrow. What would that mean to you to not have that part of your life anymore?
It would definitely be a hole in my life. I'd have to find something else to fill it with.
For this Olympics fan, medal will always be worth its weight in gold. Francis Kuo, CGTN, Virginia.
The once common European eel is critically endangered. Over the past 40 years, numbers of juvenile eels in European rivers have fallen by over 90%, largely due to more than 1 million weirs and dams that block their migration routes. Now, a group of volunteer fishermen are starting to turn the tide for eels in the UK. CGTN's Emma Keeling reports.
We're on the banks of the River Severn. It forms part of the border between England and Wales, and it's 11 o'clock at night. Believe it or not, this is the perfect time to go fishing for a critically endangered species, the European eel. Now, you might be squirming yourself, thinking, oh, those slippery black characters, but the health of European rivers depends on them. It's a 100-million-year-old enigma that keeps fishermen like Jason Sparrow guessing.
So what are the numbers like that you're getting right now, Jason?
Probably about 30.
And is that a good dip, as you call it?
I'd like more, but I'm not going to complain because I'm catching something.
Eel numbers have been declining for hundreds of years, with a marked acceleration between 1980 and 2010, seeing numbers across Europe plummet by as much as 95%. All eels caught tonight are brought together to recuperate before being released, but their chances of survival are slim. The long-term consequences of Brexit are also unknown, and organised crime has a multi-billion-dollar black market to feed. Morning on the River Severn. I've been joined by Andrew Carr, chairman of the Sustainable Eel Group, or SEG. I'm about to see a natural phenomenon known as the Severn Bore. The bore is formed when the rising tide moves into the Bristol Channel and Severn Estuary, which forces the water upstream, hopefully bringing with it millions of glass eels.
They're literally, the females, are 1 million eggs a kilo, and a big female is 2 or 3 kilos.
Shush!
And by the time she arrives, the scientists tell me, she's 85% eggs.
Eels play a huge role in ecosystems as scavengers, eating such things as mosquito larvae and dead fish. And they, in turn, are eaten by bigger fish, birds and otters. People might be sitting at home and saying, well, hang on, why are you fishing an endangered species?
Well, the thing about fishing for them is you can assist their migration over the barrier.
These barriers are the weirs, floodgates, locks and hydropowered stations that block the glass eel's migration all the way upriver. Andrew is trying to show people what can be gained from restocking eel populations. Today he's brought together eel fishermen and other supporters to celebrate the release of 100,000 glass eels caught by fishermen further downriver. This is a very precarious spot, but it's a very privileged spot because I am going to release about 3,000 of these little glass eels. And we've given them a lift by about 12 miles, and it means that they don't have to go through all those other barriers. So it's just a little less sort of hard work that they have to do. So we'll just tip a few in here and let them go. Can we get them off that endangered list?
This is the goal. It's not just the list, it's much more that their numbers increase again. We can show it through measurement. But it's not going to be solved in my lifetime. This is a multi-decadal journey.
Emma Keeling reporting from our science show Razor. The headlines again. China stocks see the worst slump on Wall Street since the 2008 global financial crisis.
The IMF maintains its global growth outlook, but the picture is less rosy for some of the world's poorest countries.
And after a slow start, the EU says 70% of adults have now received at least one vaccine dose.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.